It was a warm evening, the temperature in the low 80s. An occasional breeze wafted through the window, causing the curtains to flutter sporadically. The kitchen clock, mounted on the opposite wall, ticked the minutes away, sounding loud in the stillness of the room. Ken Weber noticed neither the breeze nor the clock. His thoughts were inward, confused, angry. He was still trying to make some sense of what he had witnessed that evening. He had thought to surprise his bride-to-be by just showing up at her office at quitting time. He was supposed to be away for 5 days, but the training session had been cut short by a day due to the illness of the lead trainer. He had arrived at her office building just as the workers were streaming out of the front door. His eyes had quickly picked up Connie's tall, slender form as she exited the building, and he was about to call out to her, but the words of welcome died in his throat when he noticed the man who was with her. They were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice him, standing just yards away. It was their apparent intimacy that caused Ken to pause. Connie's hand was wrapped in his arm, and she was chatting animatedly, her eyes sparkling. Ken had stood there for long moments, too shocked to even think clearly. With a shake of his head, he quickly followed the happy couple to the parking lot next to the office building. They moved down the last row of autos until Ken saw them headed toward the distinctive silver Jag that Connie's parents had given her for her 24th birthday that spring. They were apparently oblivious to the few people in the area. Upon reaching the Jag, she turned to her companion, and Ken's heart had almost stopped when he saw her lean into Chuck Moore, place her hand behind his head, and pull his mouth down to hers. It was no mere peck, it was a prolonged, deep kiss. Ken saw Chuck's hand descend to her bum and squeeze gently. Her quiet laughter was a dagger in his heart. He had seen enough. Ken turned and quickly moved from the parking lot. Upon reaching the street, he hailed a passing cab and went home. He had a lot to think about. Ken Weber had met Connie Sterling at, of all places, a church social for singles. He was 24 and doing quite well at the investment bank where he worked since graduating with his degree in finance 2 years previously. The bank president had made himself Ken's mentor, and it was virtually impossible for him to refuse the invitation. Sterling had intercepted Ken in the hall. Placing a meaty hand on his chest, he rumbled, "Kenneth, I really must insist that you be our guest this Saturday. I know that you've been working behind your back in the office and at school, and you do need to get out and meet people. Who knows, you may even see a young lady there that captures your interests," said Horace Sterling with a chuckle. "I also have noted that you do not seem to be a churchgoer, Kenneth. That shocks my wife and I. It is absolutely essential that you belong to a church. You must put your soul in the hands of those who can guide you." Sterling had recently, for some reason, singled Ken out for his special attention, which, while flattering, also tended to be a bit uncomfortable at times. Sterling was also the deacon of his church, and his wife, Margaret, was the head of the ladies' auxiliary and the primary arbiter of church social matters. Ken had clenched his teeth and forced a smile to his lips. He considered Sterling to be in a hole of the first order and a total hypocrite. In business, he was an immoral shark with absolutely no sense of ethics or integrity. Ken had already made up his mind that this was not the location for any long-term plans. He would stay for a couple of more years for the experience and then move on. Fortunately, he will be receiving his MBA in a few months. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invitation, and I'll certainly be there, barring any unexpected difficulties," Ken waffled. Sterling's eyes narrowed a bit, and his voice became just a little less jovial. "Oh, you'll be there, my boy. I know that you won't disappoint me," he said quietly, patting Ken on the shoulder and walking away. Ken watched the tall, very stout man waddle down the hallway. "I'm not sure that I can take another 2 years of this," he muttered quietly to himself as he walked to his office. "Hey, Kenny, I see that Papa got his claws into you," chuckled Reggie from the doorway. Ken looked up and laughed, albeit a bit feebly. "Hi, Reg, come in and take a load off." Reggie Sterling was Horace's only son, and as different from the father as night is from day. He was tall, blond, and slim with a wicked sense of humor. He and Ken had gotten to be friendly and had astounded his new friend by freely admitting that he deserved to be VP of Community Relations, only because he hadn't the talent to be anything else. "I get along smashingly with the ladies, and their husbands don't find me to be a threat, the fools, so Papa made me a VP. Not a bad deal, Kenny, what?" And he laughed delightedly. He had a self-deprecating sense of humor and almost constantly assumed the British nobility tone, a sly dig at the pretentiousness of his family. "Okay, Ken, what does the old man want from you now? It seems that he's had his eye on you for a bit, Reggie asked. Ken related the brief conversation and the invitation that Sterling had extended, emphasizing that it was more like a command. Damn, Reggie, I really don't know why your dad wants me there. It's really not related to anything to do with me. Reggie seemed thoughtful for a moment. Well, Ken, I'm not sure myself. You know what kind of religious nut he is? Maybe he's worried about your soul? That very thought seemed to tickle Reggie, and he laughed as he arose. Don't worry about it, Kenny. I'll watch your back. I have a few suspicions, and if something is going on, I'll know it, he said, and he waved and left the office. Ken looked after him for a moment, puzzlement evident on his face. He then shrugged and returned to the paperwork on his desk. Ken was no fool. He knew that he had to at least put in an appearance to appease Sterling, so the following Saturday evening saw him park his car and stroll into the front doors of the huge, pretentious house of worship. There was a stream of people heading in the same direction, and he allowed himself to be swept along into the main ballroom of the building. He glanced about him and noticed that while this was supposed to be a singles affair, there were quite a number of older, middle-aged couples present. He was just a bit puzzled by this incongruity until he saw that almost all of them were accompanied by a much younger, single female. It seemed almost like a coming-out party for the single girls of the congregation. Ken smiled to himself. Oh no, he muttered. Not this boy. Kenneth, my boy, boomed a loud voice behind him. So glad you decided to attend this little soiree. I told my wife you would be here. Let me introduce you. Sterling put that meaty hand on his shoulder and turned him. Ken saw before him a heavy, buxom woman with an imperious glare in her eye, examining him as if he were a specimen on a slide. Ken quickly took the proffered hand, resisting the impulse to bow, and kissed the huge stone on her finger. He had to suppress the giggle this provoked. Mrs. Sterling, I'm delighted to meet you, he said unctuously. Mrs. Sterling smiled, which appeared more of a grimace, and nodded to her husband. Thank you, Kenneth, she wheezed, her adenoids obviously needing attention. Please allow me to introduce our daughter to you. This is Constance, she said as she almost forcibly pulled a tall, blonde, slender woman from behind her. Ken was momentarily stunned. This was totally unexpected. It was hard to fathom. How could two so totally repulsive creatures like the Sterlings produce such an absolutely gorgeous woman? She was tall, just a bit shorter than his 6 feet, tall even considering her high heels. Constance was stunning with her blonde tresses shoulder length and her eyes a deep blue. She was also blushing furiously, and he could see the anger in her eyes. Ken gathered himself together quickly. Miss Sterling, it is a distinct pleasure to meet you. I hope that you'll save a dance for me this evening. And he made sure that her parents didn't see the wink or sympathetic smile. She looked at him quizzically for a moment and grinned. Thank you, Mr. Bisweber. I think that's possible, she said quietly. Ken smiled to himself and wondered how she knew his last name. Well, that's rather obvious, he thought. Looks like the ogres had him singled out as possible marriage material, which was rather peculiar. He certainly wasn't a part of the social set, and he certainly didn't have the requisite bank balance for such an honor. This was a conundrum that would require a bit of thought. Ken made it a point to dance with Constance as soon as the band started playing. Looks like the old folks have designs, don't they? He asked with a smile. Constance looked at him appraisingly. You catch on quickly, don't you? It really wasn't all that difficult, Ken laughed. Constance sighed, a small frown on her face. I'm really sorry about that. It's most embarrassing, but they insisted that I come with them tonight, and since I still live at home, I really had no choice. This dance really fulfills your obligation. You really needn't ask me to dance again. If you don't mind, I would truly like to occupy your time this evening, and that has nothing to do with any obligations, Ken said softly. Constance looked at him closely and was reassured. I think I'd like that, she smiled. They did dance that night, and he quite easily managed to acquire her phone number. A few calls, some interesting conversations, and they started to date. Ken's interest in Connie was apparent, and he was eagerly encouraged by both Margaret and Horace Sterling. It seemed almost ludicrous how they doted upon him and even started to call him son. He would shake his head in puzzlement before he discovered the reason for Sterling's interest in him as a prospective son-in-law. Ken proceeded cautiously with Connie. After all, any impropriety on his part could come back to bite him in the back. It was on their third date that things did get interesting. They had had dinner in a small French bistro and were strolling back to the car when Connie, her head almost on Ken's shoulder, whispered to him, "Honey, let's go back to the house. It's getting chilly out." Ken's disappointment was apparent. Shit, he would have to face the dragons again. Connie looked up at him and commented casually, "Oh, Kenny, didn't I mention that Mom and Dad left this evening for the weekend? They drove to visit my mother's sister." She paused, a glint in her eye as she grinned at him. "They won't be back for 2 days." Back at the house, Ken didn't have time to worry about acting improperly. Connie had them nude and in her bed just moments after entering the front door. She was voracious, demanding, and their wild coupling brought them to the crest and over in just a matter of what seemed like minutes. Ken lay beside her, breathing heavily. "Geez, Connie, if this is what sex is like with you, I'm gonna need a vitamin supplement," he chuckled. His eyes devoured her as she lay there, her skin bronzed and covered with a soft sheen of perspiration. "Better stock up, big boy. I love sex, and I especially love sex with you," she murmured. She then suddenly leaned over him and kissed him. "Do you love me, Kenny?" she asked almost breathlessly. "Tell me that you love me," she now demanded. Ken took her by the shoulders and looked at her intently. "Damn, you know something? I believe I do. I think that I've fallen in love with you, Constance Sterling. Good," she purred, "because I love you, and I want to be with you forever and forever, Kenny." Connie then suddenly lifted herself and straddled him. The announcement of their engagement caused major ripples in the social fabric of the community. The small local paper featured it on their front page in photos, and the paper showed a beaming Horace and Margaret Sterling with Connie at their side. There was a photo of Ken on page 6. Suddenly, Ken's position at the bank took a major turn. He was given more responsibility, and it was apparent that he was being groomed for a major promotion. Ken's conscience was a problem for him. He knew that all of this was coming to him because of his coming marriage, but was at a loss as to how to handle it. He wanted to rise in the ranks because of his abilities, not because of his marriage to the boss's daughter. It was a few months after the announcement of the engagement that Reggie Sterling strolled in Ken's office again and sprawled on a chair in front of his desk. "How's it going, Ken? Is Carol enjoying her new job? What is she now, some sort of administrative aide or something?" Ken smiled indulgently. "She's the personal assistant to the Director of Human Resources at Keats Advertising in the city, Reg. If you contacted your family occasionally, you would know that," his tone taking the sting from his remarks. Reg nodded absently. He shifted in his seat, and it was apparent that he was uncomfortable. "Kenny, I know that I've congratulated you, yet there is something that I feel you should know. I've debated with myself as to the wisdom of giving you this information, and have decided that it's something of which you should be aware." Ken looked at his friend with some puzzlement. It was apparent that Reggie was a lot more solemn than usual. In fact, he didn't recall Reggie ever being solemn. "Okay, Reg, what's so important?" Reggie took a deep breath and continued. "Early last year, and I hasten to add, before the two of you even met, Connie had an abortion. The old folks were scandalized, horrified, and well, whatever you can imagine. What was even worse, and even though she was spirited away to another state for the procedure, some word of it leaked and Connie was spoiled goods in the minds of our very forgiving and compassionate community. Do you see where I'm going with this, Kenny? That's the reason why my mother and father roped you in. You were this young, fresh-faced kid from the bank with the right credentials. You were well-educated from the right school and with a lot of potential. Also, you knew nothing about this little problem, and Connie would wind up with a good husband, making a good income, and becoming a big fish in the community." Reggie paused, finding it difficult to meet Ken's gaze. Ken was quiet for a bit, mulling over what he had just heard. "This was before Connie and I met?" he asked. Reggie nodded. He then rose and started to pace, obviously agitated. He started to speak, hesitated, and then with a sigh sat down again. "I'm sorry, Ken. I've agonized about this, but decided that you had to know." Ken nodded slowly. "Who was it? Reg? Who knocked her up?" "I think that I would like to know that." Reggie grimaced, obviously not enjoying the conversation. "No definitive proof, but I believe I know. Connie was hot and heavy with Chuck Moore, the assistant pastor at our sister congregation in Downingtown, just a few miles away. The two churches get together quite often for community events, etc. The two were an item, but when Connie's pregnancy became known, he just disappeared. He hasn't been seen here since then. He stays quite close to home, so it's just a matter of putting the pieces together. Although it's all just conjecture, he muttered. Reggie leaned forward. Kenny, I had to tell you, but I trust that while this is important, it really doesn't change anything. I told you this because I felt it was best that you hear it now and from me, rather than from some spiteful asshole who would try to make trouble later on. I know that Connie loves you and it's apparent that you love her. It shouldn't have happened, but it was all before you two even met. You do understand, Ken, right? Ken nodded again. Okay, Reg, I understand and you're probably right. It was before we met. I don't see why it should be a major problem, but I am glad that you told me. Stuff like this would eventually make its way back, and I'll now be prepared. Thanks, Reg. Reggie sighed, a smile of relief on his face. Righto, Ken, old boy. That's the attitude. I'm looking forward to the festivities, and he waved as he walked from the office. Ken sat quietly for a bit. He was more disturbed than he cared to admit. His thoughts bounced about a bit. It was before we met, so no big deal. He accepted that. So why was there this little niggling uneasiness in the back of his mind? The date of the wedding was quickly approaching. In a little over 3 months, Ken and Connie would be wed, and the activities associated with that event came fast and furious. Caterers and musicians had been hired, the ballroom had been reserved, flowers had been ordered, and the wedding list made up, cold, redrawn, and culled again. Ken's parents had both perished in a small plane crash while he was in college, and since he was an only child, there were very few names on his guest list. But well over 350 guests were on the sterling list, from family, friends, work associates, and leaders of the community, such as the mayor, congressmen, and major business owners. The final list would be just shy of 400 people. Ken was aware of the magnitude of the affair, but shrugged. He had little responsibility for any of it, and it was just as well. He really had no stomach for the ostentatious display, but for some reason the information that Reggie had imparted seems to nudge at him. He realized that all of this was before he even met Connie, so he was puzzled that he couldn't just put it aside. This nagging just didn't seem to go away. Ken felt that he needed a little more information, and with that in mind, he pulled out the telephone book and made a call. Hi, Pete. It's Ken Weber, he said after hearing his frat brother's voice. Kenny, geez, it's good to hear from you. It's been too long. What, almost 3 years? Boomed Pete Penderman. Pete and Ken were quite close in college, but as was usually the case, had drifted apart after graduation. Yeah, Pete, it's a shame. We should get together for a drink or something. I don't get into the city that often, but how about if I drive in one day this week and we can meet? Sure, Kenny. I'd like that. But before you do, tell me what's bothering you. I know you just didn't decide to contact an old friend on the spur of the moment, asked Penderman. You're right, as usual. Petey, I think I need to use your services. I'll tell you about it when I see you. How about Thursday evening? I can meet you at the Rittenhouse, okay? There was a pause. Okay, Ken? I'll meet you there. I gotta admit, you got me curious, and oh, by the way, congratulations on the upcoming nuptials. It was in the paper here. Pete Penderman was the son of Hugh Penderman of Penderman and Penderman, attorneys at law, a prestigious law firm in Center City. The very wealthy used the firm for situations discreet and sensitive, and they had garnered an enviable reputation for handling matters in a way as not to offend the genteel sensibilities of the upper crust. Ken Weber's request for his buddy was simple: discreetly find out as much as possible about an assistant pastor by the name of Charles Moore. The law firm had an outstanding in-house investigative arm, and Ken was aware of this fact from conversations with Pete during their college years. Pete was curious, but he learned well. He said he would do as Ken asked, but also requested that he be informed about the rest of the story when appropriate. It took very little time. A few days later, Ken received a large envelope with all the pertinent data concerning this assistant pastor. There was much information concerning his early background, but it really got interesting when Ken got to the part about Moore's days at Divinity School. It seems that Moore had transferred from the school in the Midwest just before his senior year to a sister school on the East Coast. The rumor had been that Moore had gotten a fellow student pregnant, but the girl had dropped out and there was no hard information that implicated him. Interestingly, the rumor persisted, which probably was the cause for the transfer. There was additional information, but it was sketchy and based on innuendo and rumor. Things about strange relationships between Moore and some of the married members of his flock. And while there was a paragraph about Moore's relationship with Connie Sterling, there was no mention of her pregnancy or abortion. The Sterlings seemed to have kept that information pretty well hidden from sources outside the community. The last item in the envelope was an 8x10 photograph of Charles Moore. Ken studied it intently for a few moments. Moore was a tall, slim, dark-haired man. He was dressed casually in a sport coat with a polo underneath. He was smiling at a point just to the left of where the camera must have been. Ken slowly replaced the photograph in the envelope, refastened the clasp, and placed the envelope in his briefcase. He then turned his chair and gazed thoughtfully out of the office window. Ken Weber lifted his head and glanced at the kitchen clock. He noted that he had been sitting and ruminating for almost 2 hours. He rose, stretched, and padded to the bar in the living room where he poured 2 fingers of scotch and then added a couple of ice cubes. He sipped his drink and walked to the glass doors, slid them open, and stepped onto the balcony of his condo. He leaned against the railing and gazed up at the sky, now filled with the sparkle of a myriad stars. Ken raised his glass in salute, a bitter smile on his face. He knew what he had to do. He drained the glass and returned to the living room, where he carefully placed the now empty glass on an end table. He picked up the phone and dialed. It was time to put his plan into motion. "Hello, Pete? It's Ken." It didn't take long. In under 2 weeks, Ken had all he needed. They sat in Pete's den, Ken glancing almost indifferently through the stack of photographs. "Sorry, Kenny. They've been having it ever since we started the investigation." They weren't even too clever about how they went about it. They were seen together often. It almost appeared that she wanted to be caught, Pete said quietly. Ken nodded. "I'm surprised that you were able to get such clear shots. Where were these taken?" They rented a room for the afternoon at a motel in Jersey across the river. The drapes weren't drawn together too carefully. "My man just shot between the curtains," Pete snorted disgustedly. Ken smiled. "Yeah, they weren't too smart at all. This stayed at the bottom of the shots, that's accurate." Pete hesitated and grimaced a bit. "Yeah, Ken, sorry. Shit, just a few weeks before the wedding, too." Ken prided himself on his acting ability. His demeanor at the bank and with Connie and her parents changed not. When in bed with his bride-to-be, he was still the amorous and considerate lover. He was aroused when appropriate, although it took a supreme strength of will. In the meantime, the swirl of wedding activities continued. Ken smiled inwardly each time that Horace Sterling groused about the obscene cost of the affair. It was approaching 6 figures, but Margaret and Connie quickly overcame his objections. It was on an evening just days before the wedding. They had just finished rutting, that's how Ken viewed it in his mind. When Connie turned to him and queried, "Come on, Kenny, what's going on? What do you have planned?" Ken turned to her in surprise. "What? What are you talking about, sweetie?" Connie shook her head in impatience. "You know, Ken, you've been looking like the cat who ate the canary. You know, kind of smug and self-satisfied. I know you. You have a surprise for me, don't you? Come on, honey. Tell me, please." It took a major effort for Ken not to laugh explosively. He managed to keep his mirth contained and moved to allay her curiosity. "Sweetie, you're just going to have to wait for the surprise. Let's just say that it has to do with our honeymoon. Right, the honeymoon. I knew it. I just knew it. We're going to Paris. That's it, isn't it, Kenny? We're going to spend our honeymoon in Paris, aren't we?" Ken smiled contentedly. "It's a surprise, sweetie, a big surprise. I'll tell you right after the wedding. You're just going to have to wait, sweetie. You're just going to have to wait." After the ceremony and at the reception, Ken strolled through the crowd, accepting the congratulations, smiling at everyone. He made his way to the small stage and, looking about, noticed to his delight that Charles Moore was an invited guest. Taking the microphone from the MC, he tapped it to make certain it was working, and he asked the crowd for their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, folks," he paused, looking around the large hall, waiting for the hubbub to subside. "I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, many of you from distant places, to support my bride and I at our wedding. Doesn't she look lovely in her beautiful white gown?" Letting the applause die down, Ken continued, "I would also like to thank my father-in-law and mother-in-law for providing such a lavish reception." Another round of applause. Ken beamed at the Sterlings. "As a token of my deep appreciation, I want to give each of you a special gift from me. Taped to the bottom of each chair, you'll find a large envelope. Please take it and open it now." Everyone bustled to retrieve the envelopes. Those seated at the wedding party table looked confused. There were no envelopes at the chairs there. Inside each envelope was an 8x10 glossy of his bride and Charles Moore in exquisite detail having sex. The crowd erupted in shock, and while there were gasps heard, there were also quite a few titters and laughter here and there. Ken continued over the noise, "My darling bride, be informed that I've taken steps to have this farce of a marriage annulled, have a miserable life," and he turned and walked out of the hall.